During this project, you'll create an original grid system contour drawing utilizing a walk level design make process. The goal is to create an accurate contour drawing that can be used for any chosen media, whether it's a graphite drawing, a pen and ink drawing, a watercolor painting, acrylic or oil painting, or even a mixed media piece. You can also use the process for any scale that you choose, whether it's the same size as your print, smaller or larger than your print, or even as a mural layout. Various grid systems have been used by artists for centuries as an aid to provide structure to their workflow and improve accuracy in their designs. This project offers just one of many methods, and I hope you enjoy it. The goal for this adjustment is to take the photograph that you took, make it black and white, and fill up your picture plane so that it can be sized up using the grid system that I'll show you in the next step. You can use either Photopea from photopea.com. It's a free open source browser-based application that can be used on a Chromebook, a Mac, or a PC, or if you have Photoshop, these steps will be virtually the same. I'm going to use Photoshop in this case, and the first thing that I'm going to do is go to File and Open and select the image that I'll be adjusting. Click Open again and it should pop up in your viewport. I'm going to crop this down, make it black and white, and then finally paste it into a document that is the size that I need to print along with a grid. So this will save me some time. I won't have to manually trace a grid over top of this. The grid will be roughly 1 inch squared, so that when I take my image and I upsize that or transfer the grid that's twice as big on my sheet of paper that I'm drawing on, it'll save me quite a bit of time. So the first thing I'll do is crop this down. I can either use the crop tool or I can use the marquee tool. I'll select the marquee tool and drag across the area that I want to work with. I'll go up to Image and Crop. And now I'd like to make this black and white. So I'll go back to Image, Adjustments. I'll go down and select black and white. Click OK. I'm going to go back to Image and I'd like to adjust the tone. So I'll click Auto Tone and I'll click Auto Contrast. This is a little bit dark to my liking, so I'm going to go back to Image, Adjustments, and I'll select Brightness and Contrast. I'm just going to bump the brightness up a little bit to lighten up the image, and now to bring back some of those details, I'll bump the contrast up just a tad. And that looks pretty good, so I'll click OK. Now I'm going to take this black and white image and I'm going to put it into a different template and put a grid over top of it to print. So I'll go to File, New, and with the preset drop down, I'm going to select US paper. If you have a different size paper that you're printing with, you can go to Custom and type in that size of paper if you're using 11 by 14 or something like that. But in my case, I'm just printing with US paper. So I'll click that, and the width of that is 8.5. The height is 11. So I'll have a little bit of leftover space in my grid, but that will still transfer since I'm making my drawing exactly twice the size of this sheet of paper. So I'll click OK, and a new tab will pop up here, and that's my new document that I'm going to paste into. So I'll go back and grab my image and resize it for this template. So make sure that if you deselected your image with the marquee tool, you reselect it. So I'm going to click the marquee tool, drag across what I want to copy and paste. Just go to Edit, Copy, and you can use shortcuts too. Edit, Paste, and paste it into this document. And it filled up the picture plane pretty well. Let me just take the zoom tool and zoom out a little bit. So you can see that there's a gap at the top and the bottom. If that bothers you, or if it pastes in a crazy large or crazy small size, you can use the Move tool to adjust the size of it, or go to Edit, Transform, and click Scale. I'm going to go ahead and grab one of the corners and drag this up. I'll upsize it a little bit. Make sure you hold shift on your keyboard when you do this. That way it'll restrain the dimensions. It'll keep it all basically the same dimensions. So now it fills up my picture plane. I can either click this check mark or click the marquee tool, and I'm ready to put a grid over top of this. Now, there's a few ways to put grids over top of an image in Photoshop. The easiest way is just to show a grid over top of it and then do a screenshot of the image as you see it. So I'm going to go up to View, I'll go down to Show, and I'll click Grid. Now that just put a grid over top of this image. These dark lines represent 1 inch. So in order, let me show you. I'll click rulers here, and now you can see that this is 8.5 inches across, and it starts here at 0 and it goes down to 11 inches, so it's 8.5 by 11. That grid is basically drawn right over top of the image for you. So I'm just going to do a screenshot of this and print this. I'll probably print it with and without the grid, so it's not as noisy when I'm working with it. But to do a screenshot, if you're working with a Mac, you're going to press Command Shift and 4. Crosshairs will show up, and I'm just going to drag across what I want to take a picture of for printing. I'll let go, and that image will show up in my downloads. And I'll place that on the desktop to print. If you're using a Chromebook, you're going to hold Shift, Control, and then the Show All Windows button at the top. If you're using a PC, you can just use the print screen button and then crop the area that you want from the print screen button's capture. So we're done with this, although I am going to save it and use it as a reference. So let me go back to View and Show, and I'm going to uncheck the grid, and I'm going to go ahead and save this and print it as is. So I'll go to File, Save As, give it a name. I'm going to convert it to a JPEG so I can open it up and preview and print it. Click Save, and it will show up on the desktop. So now I have a version with a grid over top of it that I can use to transfer, and then an image to use as a reference when I go in and shade. So I'll go ahead and print this. And in this case, I need to scale to fit. I want to fit it to that 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And you can see there's a little bit of a border, but that won't affect my transfer at all. Click Print, and I'm ready to go. Now that we've adjusted our photograph in Photoshop or Photo P, let's talk about using the grids to upsize. This process can be used whether you're using watercolor paper, drawing paper, a canvas, or if you're doing a large mural on a wall. The scale is totally up to you. In this case, I'm using that 1-inch grid on the sheet of paper that I printed off with a grid already on it from Photoshop, but I'll also take a photograph that I printed and put a grid on manually so that you can see that process as well. So let's go ahead and get into it. Here are the materials that you'll need. The photo with a grid printed, or if you wanted to start with a black and white, a photograph of the black and white. Sheet of paper, or whatever your surface is that you're working with. A ruler. And I like to cut a strip when I upsize, so I took a piece of mat board and I cut a 2-inch strip to upsize exactly twice as large. Some pencils if you're working with a drawing. And if you're not working with a drawing, obviously you'll use a pencil for the canvas as well. Some tape, perhaps a pencil sharpener, and an eraser. The grid system or grid process can be confusing and it can be challenging, but I like to keep things simple. I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate here just putting a grid on a photograph. Now again, in this case, this is a black and white photograph. The intention was to create contour lines or a contour drawing upscaled exactly twice as large as my my image here. So I'm going to put a 1-inch grid manually on this this photograph. If you're working with a color painting, obviously you'd want to print out a color reference. But let's go ahead and go through the grid process. Take your ruler, and I always like to start at the upper left-hand corner and start making marks 1 inch from the left side of the sheet of paper all the way across the top. And it's easy to start making little mistakes and be off just a touch while you're laying a grid out, and those little issues or those little inaccuracies will add up to be a real problem later on. So be as accurate as you possibly can. I like to use pencil again to lay all this stuff out just because it's forgiving and you can go in and erase if you do make a mistake. But I'm starting again on the left hand side, making a mark every inch, and I'm doing that 3 times along the length of the sheet of paper. That way when I line my ruler up, I have a better chance of that line being accurate. If you just have 2 little dots, or you measure twice to get each line, again, those little inaccuracies can add up and they can really screw your grid up. And unless you're doing a distorted grid, it matters. So here I'm putting all the vertical lines on. Again, I measured 3 times for each line, toward the top of the paper, toward the middle of the paper, and then toward the bottom of the paper. When you lay your lines out, lay them out pretty heavy. We're going to do the exact opposite when we get to our surface. We're going to lay out the lines very lightly so that we can erase them. But for the grid, if you're putting that over top of a photograph for transfer, press heavy. Now that I have my vertical lines, it's time to start the horizontal lines. I'll turn my paper sideways. And again, I like to start in that upper left-hand corner to start making my marks. And make a mark every inch from the top of the sheet of the paper. So for the vertical lines, we started on the left side of the paper. For the horizontal lines, starting at the top of the paper. Again, a mark every inch. And remember to do that 3 times on the left side of the sheet of paper, in the middle, and then on the right side of the sheet of paper. After you do that, line your ruler up as best you can and draw heavy lines horizontally. Again, that's 2 different versions. We have the Photoshop version, which again does save you quite a bit of time, or if you want to manually do it, that's how you manually put the grid on. Now let's start gridding off our surface that we're working with. Again, in this case, the goal of this activity is to get a contour drawing down on a surface and then use whatever chosen media it is that you're using to create your piece of artwork. Whether it's a painting or a drawing or a mixed media piece, you know, obviously think about that ahead of time. Once you get the small image gridded off, you need to figure out where you are in space as you work. The easiest way to do that is just to number along the top of the sheet of paper for the horizontal columns. I'm going to start with 1 on the left, 2, 3, so on and so forth, all the way across the top. And then when I transfer this or draw this out, I'm going to work from the upper left-hand corner and work across the sheet of paper and downward. Along the left side, I like to letter it. So that first block in the upper left-hand corner is A1. And then we go to A2, and then A3, so on and so forth. Then we get down into the B row, C row, so on and so forth. And now we need to put a grid again on that large surface, and it needs to correspond with the grid that we just laid out. But in this case, as I mentioned, I'm going to make this twice as large. So if I was to manually do this with a ruler, I'd start at the upper left-hand corner, do the exact same thing I just did with my photograph. But in this case, to double scale it or upsize it 2 times as large, I'm going to make a mark every 2 inches. If you're going to make this a mural, and let's say it's going to be a 2-foot grid corresponding to that 1-inch grid that you put on your photograph, you'd obviously just measure over 1 foot per column and 1 foot per row. Again, in this case, I cut a piece of mat board. It's exactly 2 inches. Make sure you measure the top and the bottom of it so there's no deviation. and start along what you consider that upper left-hand corner and go ahead and start sketching your lines in. Be careful to make this as accurate as possible. That'll save you some time from having to go in and erase. And lightly sketch lines on your surface. Remember, we're going to go back and erase these lines later on once the contours are transferred. So keep your lines as light as you possibly can. While sketching the line, it's good practice to twist your pencil a bit so it doesn't wear down on one side and get thicker and thicker. So we're going to work across horizontally to get the vertical lines. And then we'll go in and get the horizontal lines, working again from the top downward. Sketching very, very lightly. And it looks like that first line and that first column is a little heavier than the others. You should see just faint lines. When you work and you start transferring, it's good practice to have a sheet of paper underneath your hand, whether you're left or right-handed, depending on the columns and rows you start with. That way you don't run into issues with smudging. So again, we're working from the top down, very light lines, and I'll go back and I'll number and letter my larger surface, again so that it corresponds with the photograph. So we have the 1-inch grid lettered and numbered, in this case from Photoshop or manually put on, and now we have a large surface that we're going to work. If I was to continue this project and see it through, I would start with contours, lay those out, and then go in and match shading as best I can. This is an excellent practice in paying attention to positive and negative space. I'm going to start in the upper left-hand corner to lay this out. Again, this process would be the same no matter what media you're using. In the first block, there's nothing that I want to transfer, so I go to 2A, and there's just a little bit of the seat there. So on my large sheet of paper, I'll go to 2A and just lightly sketch that little bit of seat that I can see. Then I go into 3A, and I can see most of the seat. If I struggle with proportion, this is another nice feature, having a 1-inch grid. I can draw a line vertically and horizontally to basically cut up that little square in half vertically and horizontally to make it even easier to get my proportions correct. So I'm going to do that here, draw a little cross on my large sheet of paper, figure out where that seat is in space, and very, very lightly sketch it in. You'll continue this process going block by block, starting again with 1A, 2A, 3A, so on and so forth, then go down to 1B, 2B, 3B, so on and so forth. And as you work, it's also a good practice, perhaps if you can't see some of the lines that you need to transfer, to have a red pen with you or a different color than what your image is. That way you can see those contour lines a little bit better if you're struggling with that. And as you work from row to row and column to column, if this is the first time you've done this or you do start to get lost with where you are in the image, just take a pencil or a pen and cross off those blocks or the parts of the grid that you've already transferred. It's in human nature to want to jump ahead and finish up a whole shape rather than working column by column and row by row. But trust in the process, and you won't have to go back and revise or erase large areas. It's easy to get off, to be in the wrong block if you don't have the system to follow. So don't get greedy and jump ahead and jump into to other rows. It's another issue you can have. And I'll continue to lay this out, and we'll take a look at the finished contour in the next video and how to clean up the work. So here we have the finished contour drawing of the bike. It looks relatively accurate. It took some time to do, obviously, in a couple of sessions, but I got everything laid out. I omitted some of the detail that I felt I didn't need, since this would eventually become a drawing, and I'd go back in and add those details. But I did add some features, some line work, just to show where light and dark transitions were on the photograph. It will make it a little bit easier to identify where to shade on this. Now, if this were to be used in a watercolor, that would be just fine. This is a heavier paper, and it would do pretty well. Acrylic as well, but again, you can use this process no matter what the surface is that you're working with, whether it be poster board, canvas, or if you're doing a mural on the wall. The next thing that I need to do with this is to clean off the grid. You can see that the letters, the numbers, and the entire grid is there. So all you have to do is take an eraser, and since I pressed pretty heavy, when I erase this, I'm not going to be too mindful of the line work that I laid down. As a matter of fact, any areas that look a little light, I'm going to go back in and reinforce here. I can make any corrections or adjustments before I take the grid off. That way I still have the grid as a reference if I do feel I need it. So making some adjustments, and now going in and finally erasing the grid and the letters and the numbers. Remember, when you lay your grid out, to stay as light as you possibly can. And my original drawing, my contour drawing, was relatively light, but I went back in and reinforced it as I worked. And now we have a double scale contour drawing, upscaled exactly twice the size of the photograph. I hope you enjoyed this walk level project, and I hope it gives you some confidence to move into my run projects demonstrated in other tutorials. Remember to hit like and subscribe below, and see you next time.